Negotiating with the seller. We talked about the purchase agreement and in creating the purchase agreement with the seller in mind. I just want to add a few details to fill in the missing spots. You're ready to present your offer to the seller. You or the broker is going to present the offer to the seller. So what is it that you're going to do? Often case I'm the buyer and the broker, so I have to be particularly careful. But the first thing I normally do is walk in and I find something in common with the seller. Hey, buddy, how you do? Don't I know you? You know, you're from the east side. You know, what school did you go to? Something we find in common. I'm pretty well known around Detroit area, so a lot of people do know me. But even if I met someone from Oklahoma, wherever, if I met someone of a different persuasion, how you do? So what do? You know, tell me, oh, you're a real estate broker. So when did you get into business? Oh, yeah, you like it? Oh, yeah, well, it's a great business, man, you know. And when is your birthday, by the way? Oh, man, I love dealing with Aquarians. Yeah, that's cool. Find something in common. I say break the ice. Do not walk in, pull out your purchase agreement and say, okay, sir, here's the agreement here, and let's get in it, because everybody's uptight. What are you giving me? Now, you got to explain your story and your rationale. You know, in Detroit, our market values are psychologically depressed. So one of the things we try to do is to do deals with the highest possible price so we can push up the values. Like your property is worth way more than what the appraisal is going to go for. We know it and you know it. You paid more for it. So that positions the seller right now. You know his property is worth more, but it also says, unfortunately, this is all that we're going to be able to get because of the depressed psychological values. So I would like to say to them, you know, the property is worth way more, but it's hard to get more. Now, one of the things we like to do over here at Strata is to protect the community and try to list it and sell it as high as we can. Of course, the appraisal is not going to come back. More than likely, the appraisal is not going to come back near or at that value. So let's say if we sold it for $80,000, and the seller agreed to take $80,000, our purchase agreement may say $100,000. Well, the seller's concern is, well, do I have to pay taxes on $100,000? No, because we're just going to take a credit of $20,000, and then you're only going to pay taxes on what you actually get, which is $80,000. Now, there's going to be a win-win. You want to know, how does the $100,000 affect me, that extra $20,000? Here's how it affects you. It's three ways. The commission on $100,000 is more than the commission on $80,000. That could be done by just adjusting the fee percentage to the 7, make it 6 or whatever. Also, the title insurance premium is going to be higher, and the revenue stamps are going to be higher. But at the end of the day, if the seller is going to get $80,000, just work it out where the seller get their $80,000 net. So here's the question. Mr. Seller, I'm asking you a question. Do you care how I work out this deal as long as I get you your net? That's the question. Do you care how I work it out as long as I get you your price? Do not try to make a deal until you get that answer. Because if they say, I don't really care. Once they say that, they give you permission to present an alternate purchase agreement as long as they get their price. But think about if they never say that. Say, what is this you're giving me? What's this big price? What are you trying to do? What's the deal? What's this? What's that? Come to the conclusion, do you care how I do the deal if I get you your price? If he says, I do not care, they say, I don't care just as long as you get me my price. Now, you've done two things. You've laid out a rationale for a higher price. You've explained the legal ramifications or the accounting ramifications as far as the taxes. So you've laid that rationale out in a very good way. I want to protect the community. That's good news. That's number one. And number two, you've got him to agree that he doesn't really care how you do it. So now you can present to him whatever, take a credit back, and they'll go with it. Now you can present your offer. And so here's the deal, Mr. Seller. We're going to present this deal for $58,000. Your net is going to be $42,000 after all costs and everything. You want $42,000, I'll get you to $42,000, but we're going to just make it for $58,000. And no matter what it comes back, it's going to be $58,000. For example, if the appraisal come back at $48,000, we're going to still make it $58,000. And you just take credits. You give the buyer credits for improvements or whatever. You just give them credits, and so that they would get $16,000 in total credits and costs, you would still net $42,000 after all commissions, after all revenue stamp payments, after all title insurance premiums, after all recording costs. You have to specify it. In other words, you're going to get $42,000 net after all prorations, recording costs, commissions, title insurance, revenue stamps, everything. Lay it out, because if you miss one of them, the seller might say, well, I got the 42, but I didn't get my taxes reimbursed, my man. Lay it out. Don't be going in sideways or trying to fool the seller. The fact that the purchase agreement says no prorations, they should know it says no prorations. Lay it out. Don't try to fool the seller, because if they read that and say, you're pretty slick. You're pretty slick, my man. Then you got a bad situation. So lay it out up front and have at least a 5 or 10 minute discussion with the seller before you get into presenting the stupid purchase agreement. It's not a stupid purchase agreement, but it's a stupid thing to present a purchase agreement. You'll make it stupid if you don't take and lay the way for its coming. It may be a stupid purchase agreement theoretically, but if you explain it already and the seller drinks the juice, then you take the stupidity out of it. So remove the stupidity first. That's a new phase I got. Remove the stupidity first. So you befriend the seller. You lay out your rationale for your agreement. It may need repairs, but my rationale typically is simply a question of what the protecting community values, and then you lay it out and you give it to the seller, and then you really have something that you can be proud of. Now, so we're at the end of our agreement. The closing date is very important. Oftentimes I like to close. It depends. If I want to minimize my closing costs, I may close right after the first. If it's an income property, all those rent credits are mine, the security deposits are mine, and I can get all of that minimized by closing costs. I always like to pay my interest to the end of the month, and the mortgage company is going to insist, if you're doing a land contract, try to do the same thing, because you'll get, if you have an income property, you want a free month's rent. And if I close, let's say July the 8th, I get 22 days prorations that I prepay. Now when you prepay, that's interest only. It's not principal and interest and escrow payments. It's just interest only, simple interest. I prepay. I may want to prepay interest for 2 months if they would allow me, because I got 2 months. I got 2 months to collect rent. But in this case, if I close July the 8th, I prepaid to the end of the month interest, but I got the rents. The rents are far greater than the interest. So now, that's for the purposes of lowering my money I've got to write a check for at closing. So my interest doesn't start accruing until August the 1st. You pay mortgage payments after you use it. Interest is after you use it. It's not prepaid. It's only prepaid at closing. So therefore, my first payment is not to September. If you have an income property, don't make your payment on the 1st. Make it due the 5th. Make it aligned with the same date you're going to collect your rents with your tenants. If you say to the tenants you're late after the 5th, there's a $50 fine. Make your payment the 5th or the 10th. Now the seller may not want to make it the 10th, because the seller, if he's selling under land contract, for example, has got to pay it himself. And your lender payment is usually due the 1st. You get a 10-day grace period. You got to make your payment by the 10th. So using that 5th is a magic number. You got to pay by the 5th. Everything kind of corresponds to the 5th. So the closing is very important, the closing date. And here you can always call us up and discuss your closing date, your strategy. Before I wrap up, I just want to spend a couple minutes with you on a couple of other items that I kind of skipped over because I was so very excited about just the normal way I would structure a deal with the seller repair credits. But there are also other credits that you could have. There are discounts. For example, if you have a land contract, you buy it for $100,000, you put $20,000 down, you owe $80,000. Maybe you make it for $120,000 with $20,000 down. You owe the seller $100,000, but you get a $20,000 discount if you pay it off early. It's a 5-year contract. You pay it off within 3 years or 4 years. You get it early. But you can't make it a 5-year contract, and if you pay it according to the terms, you get the discount, because you got to do something for the extra discount, or it may be considered as disingenuous. So make sure you remember that. The discounts is important. I like the discounts. Also, you can use what we call bargain gift sales. You may want to study that. It's Reg 170, and I like you to go on your computer and type in bargain gift sales. It's typically for donations to charitable institutions, your university, your church, or you may have a debt on it. The debt is considered a sale. In other words, if the property is worth $100,000, but you owe $30,000, so the $30,000, you sold 30% of it for $30,000, and you gifted 70% for $1, and you could write that $70,000 off. Or if you wanted to pull some cash out, maybe you sold 50% for $20,000, or 50% of it for $50,000, which you got 20, you owe 30. Whatever you owe is considered a sale. So you got 20,000 and you owe 30,000. That's 50 grand. So you only have 50,000 to an additional 50,000 to write off. Or to give you a better example, if you owe 30,000 mortgage and you want 30 grand cash, and the property's worth 100, then you would have sold 60% of the property for 60 grand, and you will have donated 40% of the property for $1. So that's called a gift sale. Now, what's so wonderful about it is that if it's a LLC, the seller, you can enter the LLC under a gift sale arrangement, and you can own the property with the ideal that this 60,000 you're going to cash the seller out. You have 6 months to do it. So you can own this asset, and you could go to the bank as an owner and not as a buyer. Now remember what I just said. Go to the bank as an owner rather than a buyer, because an owner does not have to come up with money down. The buyer do. An owner doesn't have to put money down to get a mortgage. A buyer has to put the required down payment. So structure yourself where you can walk in the bank, refinance, and take it out. Now, it depends on when you do it. This is at the end of the year, for example. It's a great time to get into it now, so that on the tax return you already owned it. That's pretty good. And another thing is real estate brokerage fees. Very, very simple. Fees are not 6%, 10%, 5%. It's whatever you want it. Some of my fees are 25%. How much I have to put down? 20%? I make my fee 25%. Just increase the price, take me a 25% fee. And there are fees that are that high. Even HUD or the banks pay it. Some banks may sell a piece of property for $1,000 and pay a $1,500 fee. Now, what percent is that? That's a 150% fee. So it has to be reasonable still, so you can make a case for it. And if you're buying it yourself, you can make a case that it is reasonable. Try to make that case and make sure it is. And if you have any questions on that, please free to call me. And then joint ventures and limited liability companies. Simply join the LLC, refinance, and cash them out. That's the same as the the gift sale. Except if you join it under a gift sale, they gift it to you. If you join the LLC without the 501c3, you maybe pay $1 for 30%, or you may pay a note for 30%, or you may pay a substantial amount. Make sure you got your financing, assured of your financing that you can cash out. If you got your financing lined up, that's great. You've already cooked your financing. You already lined it, or you got a credit line, then you could join the LLC, give them a consideration, have 90 days, 6 months, 1 year to take them out. Most people will try this. And now, in the beginning of the year is a great time to do it, because if you do not take them out by the time they file their tax return, they may jettison you, because they don't want you in their deal and you didn't cash them out. So now is the best possible time to do such a thing. So these are examples of some of the things, and you'll find them on page 8, 9, and 10. Temporary land contracts are just great. Like I said, temporary land contracts and do the discount. And then don't forget about development fees. Development fees when there's substantial rehab is an acceptable form of equity, but make sure that your lender will go along with it. Hey, this is Herb Strather, and I got to tell you something. It's been really, 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 really great communicating with you. And I just hope that, I know I talk fast and sometimes I maybe misstate a word. If that happened, hopefully you picked up what my intent was. And if you have any question, I'm your coach, not just today, but forever. As long as I'm alive, I will coach you. And I plan to be around for a long time. So to all of you future developers, leveragers, acquisitioners, investors, I want you to get out there and I want you to do it the smart way. Don't put your money down. If you put your money down, you don't have your money anymore. Keep your money in the bank account and leverage it. As long as you have money, you can borrow money. Just leverage the deal where you don't need money. Just Herb, I really need money on this deal. The only reason you would absolutely need money on a deal is if you cannot leverage it. And the only reason you would buy a deal you cannot leverage it is if you have to have that deal. And there are some deals you have to have, maybe next door to you. The guy said, I don't care. No, I'm not discounting. This is what I want. Well, you don't have a choice. But there are deals that you can find. If it's one apartment building that they don't want to cooperate, go find the next deal. The most important thing is the blitzing part, finding a good deal and leveraging it properly. This is Herb Strather, your coach for life. Thank you so much. Today, we're going to tackle perhaps what is the most important part of doing a deal, and that is the pro forma. Now, this takes a lot of energy and power and work, so I want you to roll up your sleeves and let's get to work. We're fixed to do a pro forma. It'd be helpful if you would like, you can take out your computer and go along with me, and we're going to start from the very beginning so there's no misunderstandings. So let's start with Strather Academy. Let's type it in. Strather Academy, and we bring up Strather Academy homepage. And what I'd like you to do is go all the way to the bottom of the sheet, all the way to the very bottom where it says Student Corner. And we're going to take and hit Student Corner Downloadable Files. Isn't that wonderful? And then we're going to type in our passwords. Today it's tools, tools, tools. That might change in the future as it does periodically, and if it should, all you have to do is call the home team here and we'll give you the new password. Now let's go to, as you notice on tools, 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 you have a lot of things. You got promissory notes, goal setting, home financing options, all different types of things, but we're going to deal with what we call the pro forma, and this is a dual pro forma. A dual pro forma have two different, it's actually two pro formas. One of them is an income approach pro forma, and the other one is a flipping pro forma. If you was going to buy and flip, and we're going to start with our what we would call our financing pro forma. As soon as our Excel sheet comes up, we'll be famous. It's almost there. There's also a one called new mortgage pro forma by itself. This is a combination of both. So let's enable ourselves and let's get started. Let's make sure it's big enough where everybody can see it. And let's get started. Now let's take, as an example, we'll have a 4-flat. A 4-flat is very idealistic because it's a small apartment building, so it has the same features, the multiple units and expenses and operating expenses as you would have on a larger apartment building. Yet it's a residential facility, which means you can finance 96.5%. Now let's set what our goals. Let's say if you've done the underwriting, you found your nice 4-unit on a quality street, and today it's not hard to find many of them under-rented. Sometimes they've been there a while. People don't want to move tenants around, and if they're there and they jack the rent up, then they're going to have the cost of rehabbing the unit. That could cost them $1,000 to $1,200, $1,500, especially if they have to put carpeting or their appliances needed, painting. The whole shot could cost money. So sometimes it's easier just to leave somebody there. If they're paying $575 and you're happy, you may just want to leave them there. But suppose this is a 2-bedroom and it's under-rented. Now, and it depends on what side of town you're in. If you're in a growth area, the cap rate could be 8%. If you're in a just a kind of a medium area, maybe the cap rate is 10%. Now, if you're in Florida, New York, California, the cap rate is 5%. And a cap rate is really the rate of return you want. What do I mean by rate of return? If you have $10,000 worth of net operating income before debt service, that means your gross minus your expenses, you got $10,000 there before you make a mortgage payment, but all other expenses, taxes, insurance, everything is paid. You got 10 grand sitting there. At a 10% cap rate, you just divide 10 into 10,000, you end up with a $100,000 value. That's if you're expecting a 10% return. But how about if you would take a 5% return? And 5% cap rates are very common in high growth areas. A 5%, if you take 5 and divide it into 10, you end up with 200,000. So the lower the cap rate, the higher the value. The lower the cap rate, the higher the value. Now we have 10%. Say we got 4 units, it's a 4 flat. Vacancy and collection might very well be 5% now. But if you are going to roll over the units, you're going to suffer a slightly higher vacancy factor. And it's not just vacancy, it's vacancy and collection. I like using 10. If 10 works, I can always beat 10, 5, 7. Now sometimes for the purposes of the bank, you might have to use a tighter number like 5 or 7% because you need to show the net operating income to get the amount of financing. Even if it end up being 10, it simply means you just may not make the cash that you were anticipating, but at least you got the debt. At least you got the mortgage that you wanted. And if you're structuring deals right, you're structuring them with no money in anyway. If you could structure a deal where you really technically have no money down, then you could suffer no cash flow for a year or two until the net income increases and your cash flow increases. You have time to do that. But try to buy the building and take some cash off the table at the time of closing, and you can wait on the cash flow to increase. At least that's my philosophy. Now, of course, you can put money down always, and then you can build yourself a better cushion. It's up to you. Now, vacancy and collection factor, we got 10. The insurance cost per unit fluctuates. For an apartment building, it may run $300 to $400, and for a house, it might run $1,200. So for a 4 flat, which is kind of a really big house, if I use $600 per unit, that's $2,400. That's reasonable. Maintenance is $500 to $600. People would say it's probably closer to 10%, probably closer to a month's rent. I'm using $500 per unit here, but for our purposes, I'm going to use $600 to be conservative. So management fee is 5%. For the bank, you could put in 5%, but in reality, 7 or 8% is more typical. Now, if you have a 4 flat and you're going to get 96.5% financing, you have to live in it, at least for a year. You could buy it, live in it, move out, and you still have your highly leveraged loan and a very nice cash flow. This pro forma is based upon you renting all 4 units and you're actually not living there. So the water and the sewer at $500 per unit is okay. Gas, let's consider they each have their separate furnace and hot water tank. So electric per unit is common area, your hallway, your parking lot. It runs about $125. But I'm going to put $150 because it's been $125 for the last 10 years. It's the only thing that I think haven't increased that much. Well, gas has increased, it's $1 a foot per square foot, and water has just about doubled. It has seriously increased. Your cap replacement per unit, what is a cap? It's a capital items replaced. It's really theoretically a replacement fund. Now, if you do this right, when you buy a building, you bring it right up then. You want to bring the building right up at the time you buy it because you do not want to take your cash flow and have a lot of excess maintenance because remember your value is 10 times the cash flow. So cash flow dollars are precious. It's better to take and fix everything up right up front so you don't have to replace a lot of items that you otherwise would have to. Now that is if you can get the mortgage and you can afford to do it. Otherwise you may have to buy the building by taking the rents and fixing it up as you go, but those numbers does not really reflect the value of the building. It's not well reflected. It's not reflected properly until it is brought up to a standard that you can operate it with normal operating costs. So $200 for capital replacement is okay. Now, what is capital replacement? The boiler, the hot water tanks, carpeting, roof, windows. It is not painting. I would say it's not garbage disposals, although that's a capital item, but it's a small capital item. It's major items. Are you going to have them every year? Maybe you may have to replace an appliance, but if you have $200 per month that you're putting aside per unit, that's $800. No, this is annualized. So it's $800 a year. $800 a year is modest. You may replace the stove, then you may replace a refrigerator later. If you do not use all of the capital items, theoretically, if you do not use the capital costs, it should go into a reserve so that when you do need it, it is there. So $200 per unit capital items is $800 a year. That might be a little small. I'm going to make it $1,000 a year by making $250 expenses apiece. Now, the operating expense growth means that each year you expect some growth, and we're going to say that growth is going to be 3%, which is reasonable. A lot of people use 3% operating expense growth and 2.5% income growth. Now, the income may grow by 5%, but you're increasing all year long, so on the average, it's a 2.5%. If you increase it all in January, everybody in January, then of course it would be 5%. But you don't. You increase it at different times during the year when the leases expire. So you say it may average out to be 2.5%. But it depends on what the rents are, how low they are. It may be bigger than a 5% increase. Your first mortgage rate is whatever FHA rates are. Now, we could look at 3.65 now. Rates are very low, and you have great opportunity. It's 360 months is the term. So you have a mortgage constant, what we call a mortgage constant, is 5.49. I'm going to go back and even make our rate 3.75 because it fluctuates a lot. So it's 5.56, secondary debt service, there's none, and percent finance is 96, which is not what we want. I mean, it's 97 here. We want 96.5 because it's 3.5% down. Now, these are the assumptions that you have. So let's say that you got 4 units and they're now renting for $650. 2-bedroom, $650, that's not so bad. But you believe that they can rent for $700, or let's say $725 even. A 2-bedroom should reasonably rent for $725. It's a nice unit. If not, you're going to make it nice. So you have your gross rental income, which is this column, and then you have your second year, it's 34. So there is an increase there. Your other income is normally about 3%. This is 2.5%. But what is it? It is late fees, application fees, laundry. But suppose that they have their own laundry income, and if you don't have a coin laundry, if you don't have coin laundry facilities, it may be closer to 2.5. If everybody paid you on time, but let's assume that. Let's assume that you don't have very much extra income. You got great tenants, they pay you, and they have their own laundry facilities. Now, so that's the gross income. The gross rental, the other income equal gross income, less vacancy. We had 10%. That's 10% in each case. So this is what you call your EGI. This is a term that is used, a term of art, effective gross income. When somebody says, what's your income? My income is this. What does that mean? My income is 50 grand. Is that before vacancy, after vacancy? Does it include income property? What is it? So don't say my income is this. Tell them what it is, my effective income or my gross income before my vacancy. So let's look at property taxes. Property taxes normally run about 8 to 10% of what your gross income is. So this is 28. Let's make this $2,500 a year. That's reasonable. We're going to make it $2,500. We just increased it. What you see in yellow on this sheet is things you have to fill out. The other ones is automatic. Remember the property insurance was $600? It's $2,400. Maintenance was $600. Payroll and taxes. What do? If you have a 4 flat, you have to pay somebody to shovel the snow. You like somebody to kind of stay there. So you might take and give them a couple $100 a month off. So let's try $2,400. That you give them a couple $100 just to keep the hallway clean if they don't mind. They can shovel the snow. If there's an application, they can let you know, or they can drop the rent by.
And you could even pay them more, but you shouldn't go too far. I'm going to say $250, make it $3,000. How's that? I'm a nice guy. Property management fee. I know you run it yourself, but you cannot add that to the bottom line. Some people say, look at my income, but it does not count. It does not count a management fee. Now that's okay for your purposes because you may want all of your income contained and make sure it's passive income. And a management fee, it depends, but it should be passive rental income too. But if it's ordinary income, it is not subject to be covered by depreciation and the like. So if it is passive income, depreciation covers it. So, but you have to perform on this anyway, because if you do not include a management fee, don't worry, the bank and appraisers are. So if you want to know what the proper value is that you should be buying it, include a management fee, although you're going to manage it yourself, because when you sell it, you're going to be subject to it. Everybody is subject to it. It's the same as maintenance. Maybe the person who owned the project before runs it themselves, but you're not going to run it yourself. You're going to hire someone. And even if you do run it and you're the maintenance guy, the bank is going to put a separate cost in there. So you have to essentially pay yourself is what you're going to have to do. Because you have to include the cost. If you don't, it's going to be put in the pro forma in operating expense anyway, and you're going to fall woefully short. Do not buy a project just because someone gave you a tax return, and the tax return had nothing but supplies in it. The cost of supplies. In other words, they painted it themselves. They fixed it themselves. So what they really are reflecting is actually what their material costs. It reflects their material costs. It does not reflect labor. Put in standard operating costs and at least 1 month of rent per unit, at least 1 month rent for maintenance. So, okay, then you got me. It's $650, $1,300, $2,600. See, I'm increasing this as we go along. So your normal capital improvements, your gas is zero, and you can even put a little money in here for gas. Now you may say, Herb, why would you put money in gas and the tenants pay everything? You know why? Because sometimes they move out. If they move out in the wintertime, you're going to have a month's worth of heating bill you got to pay. You understand? If they move out in the summertime, it probably won't affect anything. But just put a little bit in there for that vacancy part. So you got gas, electric, capital improvements, legal and audit. You have legal and audit that you're going to have. Now, that means you're going to have to take somebody to court. If not, you got to pay your accountant to run the numbers. You have legal and audit expenses. I'm going to increase this to $250. Administrative is $200. Marketing, that may be plenty. Other, you know what I do with other? I usually kind of balance out my sheet. So I got $11,009. And let's do this here. Let's just increase these decimals so to see what we really have. So I would take my other, and I'm going to, first of all, zero it out. And so I got $12,017.26. So I'm going to put $117.26 in. Now I got, oops, okay, and then I'm going to take my administrative and make it $100 because that's possible. So now I got $12,000. Administrative is what you really make it. You say, well, I got a telephone that I communicate with. Okay, well, you could use your telephone. I like the number 12 because it's a good number, and there's some flexibility here. The main thing is that you should be operating around $4,000 per unit. This is $42.96, and the tenant is paying the heat, which means that I'm a little high. I do assume that I'm a little high. I'm going to take my payroll and taxes down to $2,800, by the way. And then I can increase my administrative by $300, if that means anything. So it still comes to $12,000. I like that. And here, if we flip over here, let's do the same thing. This is the second year, and I'm going to zero out my other so I can make sure I get a nice even number. Now, is it that important to get an even number? Probably not, but I just like even numbers. So I'm going to take this at 91, 90. Let's just increase this to make sure we flush it out really good. Look at that. So I got I got $91.928. There you go. I got $14,800. That sounds like a nice, reasonable number. Now I could increase that even more. I could go up to marketing and say it's 300, but if I got people I'm moving out, I can make that 403, make that 14.5. Now I'm really happy. How's that? Because I may have some additional marketing costs as a result of the turnover. So let's look at it. Now skip this part here first, because you don't know what your debt service is yet, because this automatically fills in at the bottom. So at a 10% cap rate, I'm between 120 and 145. If you remember, my NOI is 12 or 14.5. Now just think, it's 12,000. If I had a cap rate of 0.09, look what happens to that number. It goes to 133, just like that. But we're going to stick with 10 to make sure everybody's happy. Okay, let's go back to where we're at. Okay, so 140, but let's say, you know, based upon it's 120 and 145, we think the real number is 140 because we think the real market rate rents are really 725. And don't forget, the appraiser's going to lean hard on what the market rate rents are, not what they're currently renting for, but what the market is. This is your advantage. So let's say if the seller agreed to take 110, and you want them to pay the closing costs, you want some fix-up credit, and you have commissions, 7%. You can even get more. You can even get more commissions. But offer price to seller, this is credits back to you. Obviously, the 110 is the seller's. The 10,000 closing costs is yours. You get the full amount. Say you have some credit for repairs you want, but it's not very much. It's in pretty good shape because you may have to do a little painting of the hallways. All of the units are rented. So let's say you spend $4,200, which you could spend more. And let's say that you have, you're a broker, so you take your 7% commission. Or if you're not a broker, just add it back here. You know, let's say if you're not a broker, let's take it out that you're not a broker. Okay? That's 0. But let's take and add it up here. So you have let's call it 20 grand. That's 140. You have 20,000 in repairs and credits that you want them to credit you. And we'll dive into this in the purchase agreement on how to make it happen. So, and let's say that you have credits to you of 15,000. In other words, you plan on spending 5,000 and you're going to take out 5,000 net. So you have closing cost credits, retail credits. You have $25,000 credits. You ready for this? So your mortgage is going to be $135,000. There's no secondary debt. Your down payment is 3.5%, which is $4,900. Your closing cost is 10. You need 14,000. Look for how much credit you got, 25. So you have $10,000 that you put in your pocket. How's that? 10 grand that you put into your pocket. Now let's go over this again because we just want to make sure. You have a new mortgage of $135,000. You're giving the seller 110. You have 5,000 in renovations. You have mortgage and closing costs of 10 grand. You have $10,100 net. And you can have a little breakdown here on, you can really just run your closing costs exactly how you want it. You had 20,000 and maybe you didn't have a roof, but you was going to do some flooring. So you had, and this is not, you can, this is for your own benefit. You do not have to, of course, give this to the lender. Say you just got $5,000 worth of painting for, the retail we said is $28,000. This is very imaginative, but your cost is $5,000. So you make $15,000. How's that? I believe that's what it was. But this is kind of irrelevant. It's 25,000 credit. You make 15 grand. You got a credit for 20. What you do with it is yours, but always put a little of it back. If you was giving this to the lender, for God's sakes, all of this comes out all of this just cancels out. What would you do? You would just delete it on your column. You know, I'll just hide it for now. We just hide it so it doesn't show up. Oops, what did we do here? Did we do it right? Let's hide it. Let's make sure we get it hidden right. Okay, so we're nice people. We're going to hide all of this. Okay, it is hidden. So how do we look now? Oops, got to hide this too. Oops. Want to make sure we hide it, and let's look. So here you are. Let's look at what we got. These are our assumptions, our income, our expense, 120. We're going for a mortgage of 140,000. I think I should put this one column back, just the one. Let's hide this little credit here with the buyer. And you have $140,000 sales price. Here's your debt service, is $7,500. So you have 44 cash flow, 44.92. So in summary, what have we done? We found the floor flat that has cash flow in it that's undervalued, and we've ran a performer. And now we're going to enter into a purchase agreement that reflects this performer. But you have to do the performer first so you know what you're going to put in the purchase agreement. We know our purchase agreement now is going to say $140,000. It's going to be a 97.5% mortgage. And we know that we're going to figure out exactly how to get the cash out of the purchase agreement. But this is a completely different subject, and I want you to go get you some water and everything and buckle up. I'm going to freshen up, and I'm going to be back to you because we're now fixed to get into the almighty purchase agreement, which will coincide with our performer. On this performer, you're pulling out $10,000 in cash, not putting money in, but pulling cash out, and you're owning the building. That's good news. This is what we're talking about. Structuring leverage transactions, and you can do it every day. It's pretty simple, but you got to do it where it's not illegal. Now, it might be not necessarily the policy of all the lenders, because many of them normally is not going to let you take cash out if they know it. That's not the idea. But if you structure it properly, with the seller carrying your water, you can take cash out. Just hang on, refresh yourself as I'm fixed to do, because you got to get ready for this. Herb Strather signing off on performance, coming back on purchase agreements very shortly. We're going to go over the purchase agreement, which can be found in Student Corner's form. Just go to Strather Academy, go all the way to the bottom, the downloadable forms, hit that, and you go straight to the purchase agreement. That's where we can get it. Let's bring it up and take a look at it. This purchase agreement is not an ordinary purchase agreement. It is similar to the purchase agreement that we use for multi-list, but there are some changes on it. I converted it to a Word document, and I made some small changes, which is very significant. So you want a purchase agreement that's all fixed and ready, where all you have to do is just plug in certain numbers, and you don't have to spend hours and hours working with it. Because of this, there's only 4 or 5 changes I have to make in the purchase agreement, and it's ready to go. So if you're looking at the agreement right now on the screen, you'll see the first thing is the address. I got to put in an address. And right now, I took the address out for the purposes of protecting the buyer in this case. And then, of course, we got to put in a sales price. And in this case, the sales price is $58,000, consistent with our pro forma. Now, if you notice here, there are 4 options to consummate a sale. One is a cash sale. And oftentimes, even if you're getting financing, you may want to use a cash sale because a mortgage is a cash sale eventually. Now, the mortgage have a contingency clause, which is paragraph B, and it says that if the buyer cannot obtain, let's look at it. If a buyer cannot obtain a firm commitment for such mortgage within 40 business days from the date of seller acceptance, a seller's written option, this offer may be declared null and void and deposit shall be returned to purchaser forthwith. So that you could have a 40-day inspection anyway with a cash sale. You don't absolutely have to have it under a cash sale with a new mortgage. You could just make an inspection period long enough to cover your position. So I'm going to highlight some of these things I think is very important. Now, this is a mortgage assumption or a land contract assignment. It's unusual. A lot of lenders right now are simply going with a short sale, and it's not too many land contract assignments, but if you need it in the unlikely event it's there, the sale to an existing mortgage, which is the same thing, it's an assumption of the mortgage. But the sale with the seller-held mortgage is, or land contract. I like seller-held mortgages better than land contracts because you can use them for comps, and you really cannot use for comps land contracts as much because it is between the buyer and the seller, and the appraisers don't pick that up. There are certain words that they use with registered deeds that the appraisers pick up. One is WD, warranty deed, QCD, quick claim deed, MTG, mortgage. Those are picked up, and this is computer driven. So one of the things you may want to do if you're selling properties and you want to protect the comps is that you would simply form your LLC, a little mortgage company, and put things in the mortgage company. Now you have to comply with the state regs on Dodd-Frank and get licensed, but that is not a long process to do. Just contact Laura at the state of Michigan or wherever state that you may be in. It should be a requirement. Just check and make sure that you're in compliance. You can do 1 or 2 a year, I believe, but if you do 3 deals, then you trigger that compliance to get licensed. There's also mortgage companies or people who are licensed. As long as they originated for you, you're fine. Once they originated, then you can service it yourself. And that's what we do. We have an originator in many cases. Okay, so in this case, the property is subject to, there's no tenants, there's none. The brokers hereby to make this offering a deposit of $1. That's a small amount. Now, it could be more. In this case, it was $1. They brought the juice in the form of cash, cashier check, certified check, or promissory note. Now, that is really something. If I made this $1,000, which is more typical, and the check or promissory note, that would be great. Now, I don't think this promissory note should be underlined because it draws attention. Otherwise, people think it's just normally par for course. I'm just going to highlight it so you understand some of the creative stuff. Now, FHA and VA properties got appraised. In this case, it has to appraise for $58,000. I don't know why it said 82. 58,000 should be that number. Additional offers, there'll be no additional offers. The seller has, you got to have the seller's closure as far as condition of the property, lead-based paint and the like. You got to disclose with the broker, are you representing the buyer and the seller or dual agency? And here's what's very important. As evidence of title, seller agreed to furnish purchaser at the time of closing a commitment for title insurance. Now, a commitment, what is title insurance? It is insurance to ensure the title is good title. If there's something that's been unrecorded, there's a challenge, the title company would have to settle all of that so that you have good, clean title at the end of the day. And you should always get title insurance because they will go back and see whether the property taxes are paid, the water bill is paid, are there additional liens. You may research the property, but you may miss something. Title companies are experienced and you need to use them. Please always say, I will always use a title company. Good. Glad to hear you say that. Okay, if the offer is accepted by the seller and the title can be conveyed, the purchaser agreed to complete the sale within 10 days after issue of the commitment for title insurance. However, if the seller is in accordance with paragraph B or D, which is getting a mortgage, the closing will be as soon as the mortgage application approved and the closing date can be obtained from the lender. The location shall be determined by the selling broker. But look what it says in terms of getting the mortgage. The mortgage we have here is that we're giving ourselves a full 40 business days. 40 business days is how much time? That's 8 weeks. That's 8 weeks, everyone. That's 2 months to get the mortgage. And there's a very good reason we're going to do that, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Okay, so you have 8 weeks to get the mortgage. And just to make sure we're okay here, I'm going to highlight this. I'm going to highlight this so that we can connect the dots. Okay, now if there's a problem, objection to the title, you got 30 days to fix it. Or at the buyer's option, it can be unraveled. That's not the seller's option, it's the buyer, because the seller may have a problem and want to change his mind, and the buyer say, hold it, I'm going to take it and straighten it out myself. Now, here's one of the most important things. It's the default clause. If in the event of default by purchaser, the seller shall, at his sole option, declare a forfeiture and retain deposit as liquidated damages. That's it. That's all. You cannot have it reinforced, the terms reinforced from the buyer's end. That's all the seller can do to the buyer. But in the event of default by the seller, the purchaser may, at his option, look at this, elect to enforce the terms and or demand and be entitled to immediate refund of their entire deposit and full termination of the agreement. So the buyer can elect to enforce the terms, but the seller cannot. Of course, how about if the buyer cannot enforce the terms? That means the seller could get a better offer and cancel and walk. It would be the stupidest thing in the world for the buyer to let the seller off and walk. And it would also be the stupidest thing in the world for the buyer to obligate themselves to liability if they should default somehow. In other words, the buyer may suffer a tragedy and cannot close. Then they say, you defaulted, you got to prove you didn't close. You may change your mind, but you're still obligated to close. Well, you walk away and you lose your deposit. That's what happens. And the reason that is important is that the seller may have been using that money, the anticipated money from closing, to buy another deal they were going to make 50 grand on. Once you default, you hurt the seller, he don't get the money, he can't make the 50 grand. Guess how much money he can sue you for? Would you guess it's the amount of your deposit, or would you guess it's the 50 grand? You guessed right, it's the $50,000. In other words, the seller can now sue you for $50,000 on a deal to which you only had a $1,000 deposit on, or even in this case, initially a $1 deposit. The seller can sue you. Unlimited liability, so always protect yourself. And if you learn nothing else, remember that. Now, one of the things you always want to do is to limit the amount that the buyer have, build it into the financing package. And the clever purchase agreement takes the prorations out. Paragraph 13 says all the taxes and assessments, which is a lien upon the land, have to be paid. It says the current taxes shall be paid but not prorated. Will you look at that? Now, once again, I don't think it's a good idea to put these things, anything that draw attention to anyone, but the FHA will allow up to 6% of the closing costs towards closing costs. If the closing cost is 4.5%, theoretically that's all they're going to allow, the 4.5%. You cannot get 6% if you don't have 6% for closing costs. But if you have more than 6%, all you can get is 6%. The biggest part of the closing cost is property taxes. So if the seller have to pay the property taxes and you don't have to prorate them, that's a huge, huge step towards lowering your closing costs, and it assures that the 6% will cover it. Now, if you close this deal on June the 28th, it's not much advantage because the taxes are due July 1st. So that means that you would only get 2 days worth of prorations. If you waited 3 days later and closed it July 1st, they would have to pay the entire property taxes, at least for the first half. And then you would get at least 6 months. Now, if you close this deal, say, September the 5th, and the taxes had not been paid yet, the seller would be obligated at that point to pay the taxes all the way through June the 30th. and you would get a full credit. The reason is that the taxes are delinquent now, so they have to pay all taxes. They cannot pay a half year. They don't have that option to pay a half year in September. The only option they have is to pay it up through June the 30th in order to get it out of delinquent status. If they paid it up through the first half, then the second half would be deemed delinquent because they passed the period of time that they could pay the taxes half and half. So that's the timing of closing is critical in a purchase agreement. What month are you closing this?
Okay, so the next paragraph is not that important. The buyer can get you some insurance and stuff and collect the fee. Now, paragraph 25 is important. Paragraph 15 says about the execution agreement, the purchase knowledge subject to 25, they're going to take the property as is, and the brokers do not warrant anything. But this is kind of disingenuous a little bit. They're going to take it as is, but they want certain conditions. Okay. Now, paragraph 16, the seller gives the buyer the magic 6%. Here's the answer. Let's highlight that. Okay, so let's go again. Number 17, if there's a balloon, in many cases there are balloons, they do not want it to affect their broker. Hold the broker harmless. Time is paragraph 18 is time is of the essence. 19 is legal document with a lawyer. 20, this agreement supersedes any other agreements. In other words, you may have an agreement, now this one comes along. The other ones are dead. This supersedes. You can't have 3 or 4 agreements out there if something supersedes. So this states that if you sign and just re-sign, you should terminate the one first and then sign the new one, if it's the same between 2 parties. If 2 or more persons execute this as joint and separate, the risk of loss, if there is a loss, is required that the seller is going to do the purchase has the option of cancel agreement and deposits shall be refunded to the purchaser to proceed with the closing, and at his their sole discretion either require that the seller repair the damage before the closing or deduct the purchase price a fair and reasonable estimate of the cost of repairing the property. That all have to be done before the closing. After the closing, it's a bit late. The seller has an obligation to look at the property before the closing. There's no seller acknowledges there's no representation, promises, guarantees, or warranties of any kind. The broker certainly do not want to be liable for anything. This deal, the paragraph 24 deals with how long before the property becomes, before the purchase agreement cancels. So you got 5 days, it's irrevocable for 5 days. Now paragraph 25 is probably the most important paragraph. It states that the purchaser do or do not want to choose to have the property inspected. If you choose that you want to have the property inspected, which is necessary if you want to do a little creative financing, typically how the deal is presented is that the seller is presented, we're going to get into the deal, but a property is the full price that you desire to buy the property plus, well, let's say the full price that you desire to buy the property for, which includes credits back to you. There's a couple of things. One, you want to stabilize the community, so there's an effort to push the prices up as far as possible. If the appraisal come in low, then so be it. You just take a credit to keep the price the same so we can help stabilize our community. Because the banks, FHA, they've been really hard selling properties very, very cheap, pushing values down. And we've got to fight back, if you will. We got to fight back in the sense that we want to buy the property or sell the property for the full value of the purchase price plus the fix-up, If you bought something for $50,000, need $15 grand in fix-up, your total cost is $65. But yet if you record a deed for $50, you see what you just did, you push the values down. So make it $65. Now if it came back for $60, still make it $65. Just take a $5,000 credit. In other words, keep the price the same, and the seller just give you the difference as a credit so that the seller is not hit. You do not lower your price. The community is not hit. The price is the same. Paragraph 25 is the important paragraph. And let me read it. Seller shall permit an inspector or purchaser choosing to have access to the property for the purpose of inspecting and reporting upon the physical condition of the property, including structural, plumbing, heating, and electrical systems, air quality, verification, square footage, period. Now, that language is different than the standard language because it didn't provide all of these items to look at. It's more or less provided for the verification of square footage, but this is typically found if you're looking at an apartment building. It's typically not done for a house because you look at it and it's your housing inspector and that's it. But we're saying that all of these things got to be looked at, and the inspection shall be concluded within 30 business days after acceptance of this offer. Now, that could be 30 business days or it could be 50 business days. Theoretically, it should be concluded, you should allow for enough time for you to get a mortgage. And after you get the mortgage, any negotiations that you're going to do with the seller, as far as credits and stuff, should be concluded in writing. You theoretically cannot put it in writing before. The reason you cannot put it in writing before is very, very simple. You have to disclose it to the mortgage company. We're not here to create any fraudulent transactions, because when you make application, they want to have all of your agreements. If you have an agreement that you're withholding, then that could be criminal. And you do not want to withhold anything. Now, if you made a verbal agreement with the seller that they're going to give you 10 grand, depending upon what the appraisal come back and all of that, because the seller going to want their net. If they say, look, I want 50,000 net, well, how about if the appraisal came back for 50? You get nothing, theoretically. So you may have a handshake with the seller to give you back X number of dollars, but it's subject to the appraisal, it's also subject to you doing your inspection, saying how much you need. The whole thing is subject. But after you got the mortgage approved, you know all of those answers. So you can now go back and tighten it up. It may not be the amount you negotiated for, it may be a amount less, or it may be the exact amount. Although the appraisal didn't come back, you're not going to get the money. You just take a credit to protect the comps in the community. I hope you understand what I'm saying. Although your price may be the same, you may not get the amount of money because the appraisal did not come back. And the lender is only going to loan based upon the appraisal. But you want to take and you have a handshake with the seller. Now, that is not enforceable. If the seller changes their mind, too bad. That's why you don't have to disclose it, because the Michigan statute of fraud says it has to be disclosed. It has to be in writing. A handshake agreement, you give me 5 grand back, is not an agreement that is enforceable. And the seller, of course, can change their mind. He said, I changed my mind. The deal is over. So you leave yourself an opening. If he changes his mind, you change your mind, you can walk. Or you negotiate after the mortgage is approved. Once the mortgage is approved, you sit back down to the seller and revisit it, and you will make an addendum at that point. Usually, the responsibility is on the seller to do the repairs that you want, these extra repairs. Now, the seller can, in fact, is going to give it to a contractor, and maybe that contractor is one that you choose. If they do choose it, and he give it to your contractor, he's going to have you sign off and release him from any obligation to give you any improvement dollars as agreed. And he's probably going to put your name on the check. And we could talk about the check, but I think maybe we could even combine these ideas right now. Kind of a shortcut to our remaining items, because we're just about ready to wrap up things. The seller can give you, the title company can give the seller 2 checks totaling the amount. That's one thing. Or the seller can pay for the closing completely separate. The seller can pay for the closing statement. The seller can pay for the repairs pursuant to the purchase agreement completely separate. And you would essentially, the seller would write a check after the closing. But you could work these details out with the seller. But one thing for sure, it's not going to go on the HUD-1 that the seller gave the buyer X number of dollars. If it's a very small amount, that's one thing. If it's substantial, the answer is no. If it's the seller's responsibility, then let the seller work it out. You just give the seller the contractor, and perhaps that'll work. So the balance of this says,
The inspection shall be concluded within 30 business days after acceptance of the offer. If the inspection includes any defects or needing improvements in the property which result in the buyer having cause to be dissatisfied with the condition of the property, they shall notify the seller in writing. The seller shall satisfy their concerns, or the buyer may, at their option, cancel this transaction and receive their deposit back in full termination. Failure of purchaser to notify seller of such defects needed or repairs or improvements within 3 days after said inspection period ends shall deem the purchaser satisfied, and this purchase shall go forth in the as-is condition. Notwithstanding anything to the contrary, seller agrees to replace the furnace and hot water tank and any other reasonable request. That's pretty cool. In this case, the seller has agreed to replace the hot water, the tank, and any other reasonable request. That leaves way for a $6,400 credit to the buyer. Okay, so this pretty much wraps up the purchase agreement. There's an arbitration clause. There's a clause that you can use faxes. There's a clause you should get a lawyer, and then it's your signature. So that is it with the purchase agreement. Now, purchase agreement is a legal binding document, and you could very well get a lawyer, or you could always call us on the purchase agreements. As brokers, agents, we are experienced, and we would be happy to help any of our students to draft a proper purchase agreement. As a matter of fact, we insist, if you're going to do a purchase agreement and you're one of our students, we want to make sure you do the agreement right. So don't try it home alone. Call up your coach. Call us right over here at 313-444-9691. Or go to the student corner, go to the chat room, send me a direct email, hstrather@gmail. Let us make sure that these agreements are properly structured. We do not want you to get hung up in agreement that you did it out of control and we have problems. So I thank you so very much for listening to me. We have just one little other item we're going to visit, and we're going to wrap things up. I'll be back with you in a few minutes.